Sometimes whinge about the clumsiness of our federation, about the sort of obstruction in the upper house, etc., duplication of efforts, so on and so forth. But I think the point is this, isn't it? When in a system that has a government without those checks and balances, like New Zealand, as we discussed last week with Oliver Hartwich, big mistakes are made. And yet it seems that, and I don't want to just focus on the federal government here. As I said, when this is fully, everything comes out, as I hope it does, I think that'll be the smallest of the errors, big as it is. But this is what happens, isn't it, if we abandon our normal checks and balances that are inherent in our process?
That's exactly right, and that's what the MRC identified in the outstanding report that you referred to earlier that Henry Ergas was part of. As you said, emergency powers should be exercised for a limited time for clear purposes, and they must be exercised in public. Unfortunately, in the last 2.5 years, there was very little pushback against what, as you said, federal and state governments did. But the debate about, certainly from a Victorian perspective, about some of Dan Andrews' outrageous emergency powers did lead to some changes. But when you've got governments operating in secret, and as I said, as outrageous as what Scott Morrison did was, let's also put this into perspective. It's no different from what the premiers did. It's no different from, again, my state, the premier of, Dan Andrews, not giving full information, obscuring data, obfuscating the facts. The Chief Health Minister, the same. So this idea of cover-up, of secrecy, of not telling your colleagues, of not telling the public, of not telling the Parliament, is a continuation of a trend. Again, in Victoria, the Parliament was suspended. That suspension was supported by the opposition. It was supported by the media. There were very few faces and there were very few voices who stood up and said, as we did in the Second World War, well, we must continue to debate these things. So it's exactly as you outlined, Nick. Emergency powers have to be identified, have to be short-term and have to be public.
Well, look, John, at the risk of stirring up some horrible memories, I want to play you...
Don't do it, Nick, please.
I'm going to. I'm going to play you an extract from a conversation we had exactly 2 years ago this week when Victoria was deep in lockdown and the Menzies Research Centre hosted a special lockdown forum. Well, hello and welcome to a very special and very live edition of Water Cooler. We've convened this special Water Cooler panel forum because of the seriousness of what's happening in Victoria and our concerns about that. We're appalled at the suspension of democracy there, the fact that the emergency powers are in place and have been in place for so long, we don't know for how long, meaning effectively that there's no cabinet, there's no parliament.
You're right, Nick. In Victoria and in Melbourne, where I'm speaking to you from at the moment, we're suffering an 8 p.m. curfew, 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. We're not allowed outside of our house other than for a number of very limited reasons. It's exactly as you said, Parliament has attempted to be suspended. The rule of law seems to have gone out the window. And something else that we might touch on tonight is, by and large, the lack of media scrutiny and accountability of.
Well, that shows in part, I think, what professionalism that ADH brings to production when you see what we were doing 2 years ago at the Menzies Research Centre. But look, we made some important points. John, were the 262 days of your life lost to COVID through lockdowns worth it? No.
No. This is, again, something else that hasn't been discussed. As the health professionals, as the politicians, as the media cheered the lockdowns, there was no discussion of the costs.